I'm Dr. Jodi Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. A very warm welcome back to the podcast. A very warm welcome back to listeners of the podcast for some time and to new listeners as well. Before we begin, to make sure this podcast stays a very safe space for listening, I just want to share a brief content warning to let you know that in today's episode, we'll be talking about understanding and empowering recovery from complex trauma, a condition that can develop in response to abuse, neglect, or violence. It is with great pleasure today that I'm speaking with Dr. Cathy Kezelman AM. Cathy is a medical practitioner, a mental health consumer advocate, and President and Executive Director of the Blue Knot Foundation National Centre of Excellence for Complex Trauma. Cathy is a prominent voice in the media and at conferences, and she's the author of a memoir chronicling her own journey of recovery from childhood sexual abuse called Innocence Revisited, A Tale in Parts. On Australia Day in 2015, Cathy was awarded an AM, which, for those of you who are not here in Australia or are not sure of that acronym, it's Member of the Order of Australia, a very high honour for her service to community health as a supporter and advocate for survivors of child abuse. So I can also tell you Cathy is a very patient woman, and she's joining us here today from Sydney. So Cathy, thank you for joining me. I'm just so thankful that we have a chance to have this really important conversation today.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jodi, and I'm looking forward to it as well.
Oh, thank you. I really want to start by asking you, how is trauma defined?
Trauma is unfortunately part of the human condition, and we all experience stress and anxiety in our everyday life. But it's when that stress becomes repeated and overwhelming and overwhelms our capacity to cope that it crosses over into trauma. And certainly we've seen in the world over the last couple of years with COVID and now with, a lot of unrest and war, the world is experiencing a lot of trauma. And so we're all very familiar with it.
Indeed we are. You're exactly right. And yes, and it's certainly, I think, just a moment for me to say to those of you listening that just be mindful of where your information is coming from, particularly at the moment. We know overseas that there are two wars, and so just be mindful of your news consumption because that can certainly take its toll too, can't it, Cathy?
Yes, no, and certainly, there's so much exposure, not just to news, but to personal opinion and commentary.
Yes.
It's very easy to be flooded. And because a lot of the information at the moment is horrendous and horrific, everyone does need to be very careful about how they filter what they listen to and the volume of what they listen to.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things I've always been curious about too, and I know listeners will be pleased to understand this difference, is between trauma and complex trauma. So where does the difference lie between those two terms?
Yeah, so when people think of trauma, people think of a flood, a bushfire, maybe an assault as an adult, and not to ever minimise anyone's experience of trauma. But when we talk about complex trauma, we're talking about trauma that's often repeated, often ongoing, and often extreme, and it tends to be interpersonal trauma, so the trauma between one person and another. And you mentioned before abuse, neglect, violence, exploitation. And it can occur as a child, it can occur as a young person or as an adult, and often occurs across the lifespan. And what we know is that people who experience complex trauma often really struggle with a whole lot of impacts because it actually impacts the very sense of a core sense of self and many other things.
Something that I understand to be true, but I'd love for you to share some more insights into, is this idea that different people can be exposed to similar circumstances. For example, there was an incident at the Lint Cafe in Sydney some years ago. And so in the same circumstances where there is a significant threat to safety for the people that were present, and some people will respond experience trauma as a result of that being a part of that situation, and others won't. So can you help us to kind of understand what is it that can make the difference when two people are exposed to the same situation, but one will be traumatized and another won't be?
Well, we're all individuals, and we're all very unique individuals, and we, come to the world with our own DNA, our own genetic imprinting, and our own experiences along life's journey, and as well as our own backgrounds and cultural influences. So it's incredibly complex and layered. And so when different people experience different traumatic events, yes, it does impact people differently, and it's it's dependent on, as I say, a whole range of elements. But certainly the response that people experience at the time is also very critical. And many people who've experienced particularly complex trauma have never felt safe. They've really struggled for a very core felt sense of safety. And they also struggle to trust because they've been so profoundly betrayed by other human beings.
Yeah.
And so for them, the world is inherently dangerous. And when it's inherently dangerous, you're primed to be triggered by other traumatic events.
Yes, I understand. And I know that you have a personal understanding, of course, and I mentioned in your introduction your memoir, Innocence Revisited, A Tale in Parts. And I know that you, in your role at Blue Knot Foundation, are bringing your own personal experience, of course, and your professional expertise to make a real difference for the people that are touched by your organisation. And I wondered if you could talk to us about how your experience of complex trauma affected you and what made a difference for you. What helped?
So, for many, many years, I was quite oblivious to what had happened to me as a child. I blocked it out, as many people do, and I was quite amnesic for, just about all of my childhood, good and bad. That, I suppose, is the first impact, because what it did was numb me to experiences, and so I couldn't actually take in the joy and the pleasure of life either. And I was fairly cut off and unemotional. I was married with 4 kids, working as a doctor, but quite robotic in retrospect about the way I went about things, and not, despite the best of intentions, not really able to be there emotionally for my children.
Yeah.
And so then what happened to me when I started to unravel, and that happened because of the sudden death of my niece, which is often, different things trigger people's trauma. And it meant that, very quickly I was, virtually bedbound, pretty non-functional, had to give up my job as a doctor, and started experiencing panic attacks, severe anxiety, depression, was quite suicidal, and also experienced what are called flashbacks. And flashbacks, for people who haven't heard of them, are the actual re-experiencing of fragments of traumatic experience. And so what happened to me, I was in middle age, and I would be completely destabilized by a reliving of an experience with the fear and the anxiety and the pain and the sensations and the movements of what had happened to me, but yet without the narrative. So it was really terrifying. And even as a doctor, I didn't know what a flashback was. For my husband, who also had no idea what it was terrifying. And until we actually could put words to it and start to understand that what it was my trauma returning to my consciousness, and I was re-experiencing what I blocked out all those years.
Yes, I can understand it was terrifying for you and your husband and your children. Just
That's right.
No understanding as to how you've gone from a fully functioning adult to a woman that can't get out of bed and experiencing so many challenges with your mental health.
Yeah, and you also asked what helped me.
Yes.
What helped me were a couple of friends who were able to really be in there for the long haul and not try and fix it, but just say, I'm here, One of them who plied me with jelly babies, which were very therapeutic. But just to walk alongside you.
Yeah.
And what was going on for me was terrifying for me, but it was also scary for the people who knew me, because I was no longer the person, that competent person that they thought I was. And also what helped me was going to a therapist who, I spent many a session with, who, did help me to feel safe. I did learn to trust, and really helped, me to start to unpack and process the trauma that I was re-experiencing through flashbacks.
Yes.
But that was a long and gradual process as I really tried to integrate my story and myself,
Yes.
and really learn about who I actually was, because even though I was a doctor and appeared to be very functional, I really had a very low sense of self and a low sense of self-esteem, which is very, very common for people who've experienced complex trauma.
Yes, that makes sense. And yes, I can just imagine the journey that you were on with your psychologist to untangle so many years of abuse, and then of course the healing and the recovery that comes with it. And what you mentioned before was about your psychologist helping you to feel safe. And it's so important, isn't it, to sort of help to reduce the sensitivity of the part of the brain that just sees threat everywhere.
Yeah, well, that's right. So when you're growing up in danger, and, when in my situation as a child, there was no real safe person to go to, and no one who could help me make sense of what had happened. The best thing I could do was block it out.
Yeah.
And so I used a mechanism called dissociation to actually, what it did was compartmentalize my experiences of trauma and sort of lock them away in my brain so that they couldn't be accessed, and they were separate from one another. So it was a fascinating, once I developed the reflective capacity to understand that, it's really a brilliant way for the brain to protect someone's mental health and stop them completely dissolving and being completely overwhelmed by trauma for which you have no words and no understanding.
That's right, and that's why it's so important to find the right sort of person, isn't it, to support you in your recovery. And I'm curious, I presume, can I just ask before I tell you what I'm curious about? What sort of a doctor were you, Cathy?
Yeah, I was a GP.
You were a GP.
And I knew this therapist from referring other people.
Aha.
So I was very lucky because, it can be hard to find someone who, has the skills to be in there for the long haul and to be patient, because what was happening was she was not doing anything to, bring these memories out or bring these experiences out. That was about me in a relationship with her and feeling safe enough for that to happen. And so she provided the space, both the physical and emotional space, to enable a sense of safety that meant that I could finally revisit what had happened to me as a child and what I hadn't been able to process.
That's it, and be supported through that, because I can only imagine how difficult it is. My curiosity, you've actually answered my question, because I was going to ask you whether or not it was the first person that you connected with as a psychologist that you connected with and had a good relationship with, because it's not always the way, and that who they are and how they hold space for you is, and your relationship, your therapeutic relationship is just foundational, isn't it, to the healing?
Absolutely, because just as you've been harmed in relationships, so you're healed in relationship. And, I was certainly not an easy client because I was incredibly suspicious and distrustful. And, it did take me a long time, despite her being there as relatively unconditionally as one can be.
Yes.
Despite, and she also maintained, obviously, good boundaries, which actually helped with the sense of safety. But it took a long time to actually get there because of the trauma I'd experienced.
Yes, I can only imagine, and it must be. I wonder, do you reflect often now, from the position that you're in now at the Blue Knot Foundation, to be able to sort of see how you can make a difference to so many other people, and that whilst what you've been through has been so incredibly difficult and incredibly traumatic and challenging, that you've come so far that to be in a place now where what you've been through, as awful as it was, is what gives you what you need to probably make the connections with the people who need the help themselves now.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not the first person to use a personal experience to, develop a passion and want to create change, but I'm also aware that in a way I was privileged, because even though I'd had, these things happen to me, I also did have a stable family.
Yes.
I had a husband who was supportive, but I did have kids, although it was incredibly challenging time for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I also had the capacity to afford ongoing therapy.
Yes.
And not that everyone's path is through therapy at all, but that was my path. And I was able to, to find someone, who was highly relational, able to be there, and just able to be there for a long period of time, and as long as it took. So that's a unique experience, and I'm very, very aware how unachievable that is for a lot of people.
Yes, very much so. You remind me of it was my third psychologist who was the one who was the right fit for me, and I remember I said goodbye to him many times, thinking, "See ya, finished." And of course, then something would happen, and I'd come back, and eventually we parted ways, and then I reconnected just to sort of have a brief check-in, and he let me know he'd retired, and I thought, goodness, I'm so grateful that his retirement has happened at a time when I wasn't still a patient, because that could be
when you are more stable. Yeah, and look, my attitude is that we could all, the whole world could benefit from a therapeutic process, and if you need to go back, you need to go back, and certainly when you've experienced trauma, different things may trigger you at different times of your life, and different life stages can bring new challenges. And so having that unique therapeutic relationship as someone who knows you, better than you know yourself in a way, is really such a gift. I'm very grateful, and it is why I'm so passionate to see that other people can find their pathways to healing, whatever they are. Yeah,
it's such a ray of hope for people, us having this conversation, and for you to be able to say, this is where I was, this is what I've come through, and as much courage as it took to be able to seek the therapy and get that help, to see where you are now will give listeners hope to know that it's not easy, it's a bumpy ride, but there's help available, and that the healing can happen. And you're an example of that.
And there are lots of stories of healing and inspiration, and and it's about holding on to the hope, or finding someone who can help hold on to the hope when you're not feeling hopeful, and know that there is a possibility, but the path can be challenging. But to also look around and see, doesn't have to be a therapist, who around you may be someone that you can just trust that little bit and just sort of test the waters with, and who may be able to just be there and give you the jelly babies or whatever it is.
I love that. I know they've got jelly beans at the chemist, so it's absolutely medicinal. Absolutely. I love that your friends were so supportive of you and just showed you that empathy. And I've spoken about it before here on the podcast, and I practice it, as a parent, as a partner, as a daughter. I practice it as much as I can, whilst our instincts can be to try to want to fix things and make things better. When we see our loved ones in pain and suffering, we instinctively often want to kind of jump in and fix it. But really the best thing we can offer is that place and space to talk and be heard, to listen. 2 ears, 1 mouth is what Mum's often said to me. Although, look at me, I'm a podcaster. 2 mouths and 1 ear is probably what I should have been born with. But I just think that listening and that just, being there to really validate how someone feels is incredibly powerful. And, how lovely that your wonderful friends are able to do that, plus jelly babies, because they certainly help a lot too.
For survivors, absolutely to listen, to be heard, but also to be believed is absolutely critical. And we certainly heard that, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse.
Yes.
How many people had, tried to disclose at different times of their lives and were dismissed or had what they said minimised or were punished for trying to speak out. And so, that's just so critical for a survivor. And, certainly for me, that was a challenge because there was a stage at which I sort of didn't believe what my flashbacks were telling me. And so I was pushing away my own experiences. And if you've got someone external that's, doing that in spades, it makes it incredibly difficult to actually get to a point where you can start to process it, because the worst thing that can happen is to be invalidated.
Yes. I'm really glad you raised that. And that's a really clear message for all of us as well, as we go through life with the people around us who we love and care about, and friends we have and friends we haven't met yet. So I really appreciate you raising that. One of the things that you touched on before that I'd love to sort of circle back to is this idea of you acknowledged that you were so privileged to have access to help and have the financial means to access that help in a stable family. And when we look at access to help, there are things that can prohibit people, aren't there, and stand in the way of people either firstly looking for it, or if they find it, necessarily being able to access it. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that and what you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it can, because of issues with trust, it can be incredibly hard for survivors to reach out to anyone to help. And also because, we know that, many practitioners of all sorts, have not had the education and training around, complex trauma and how to respond. So we know that people have had experiences with, the care sector, the justice sector, etc., where they have experienced additional trauma. And that's not because they're accessing bad people. It's because they're accessing people who don't understand and who don't, can't draw on that empathy and compassion that you just spoke about for whatever reason. And we all, have days where we, do it better or,
Yes.
Better or less well. And so it's much easier to, say this is what you should do than actually do it in the moment all the time. But because of that, it's been very hard for many survivors to reach out and seek help. And obviously also because often survivors have not been able to complete an education or may not be able to hold down a job. Some may be homeless. Some may, have not, been learned to read and write. And so there's all sorts of, some have used alcohol and drugs as a coping mechanism to try and, numb their distress. So there's all sorts of reasons why people, are unable to access services or have barriers to access them. And then it's the nature of the services that are available. Yes, there are services, but, arguably, there need to be a lot more of the right sort of services. And I think navigating the service system can be incredibly challenging, particularly, for example, if you're living with a disability, when you're, very isolated, there's no one in your community that you think you can trust. It's really very, very hard to get to first base.
Yes. Does stigma or shame play a part in people's reticence about reaching out for help?
Yeah, look, I mean, people who've experienced, different forms of abuse, particularly as a child, often blame themselves. Because how does a child make sense of the fact that, a parent or a caregiver or someone close to them is harming them when they're meant to look after them? So that often becomes internalized as shame, which is quite a withering emotion. And shame can stop us from doing a whole pile of things. And when you, have a society which is quick to judge, as we all are, human beings love to judge others, and we look at people in adulthood still struggling with the impacts of what's happened to them, and maybe not being able to, perform at the level that others can, we may judge that without understanding that, they've got a perfectly good reason for that, and it makes total sense in the context of what they've experienced. And so, Yeah, I mean, so there's many, so there's shame and there's stigma and it's also a very discomforting subject, you know, talking about abuse. We don't like to think about what people may do to children or others. And so we tend to, block it off as a society. And so there is a lot of stigma and a lot of shame, and it's sort of compounded. It's only in very recent years that people have been able to come forward and say, I experienced depression, and that's become a little bit more socially acceptable. Saying you were sexually abused as a child, much less so.
Yes.
Saying you're growing up in a family in which there's domestic violence, much less so. So there are more conversations happening, and yours is one of them.
Yes.
But there needs to be a lot more to break down the barriers that these things absolutely happen, and they need to be spoken about. They need to be examined where they can be responded to, and people can start to find a pathway to rebuilding a life that arguably they should have had prior to whatever happened.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I'm starting to think about, I know that as we're recording this, that there are fires in Queensland, and I know here in Victoria we've had some disastrous fires in the past, and it makes me think of people who, whereby their house might not have been burnt down, but a neighbour's has. And this idea that some people are like, well, I'm one of the lucky ones because I still have my home. And so I'll leave the help for the other people who've lost their stuff or who've been more impacted. And I wonder what you might say to listeners who sort of feel like other people are worse off than me, because most of us can put our situations into perspective. I often sort of think about things that go on in my circle, and I think, well, there's always somebody worse off. Not that doesn't mean that we can't be suffering through what we're going through. What would you say to listeners who might have that kind of other people need it more than I do, I'll just get through it on my own kind of thinking when it comes to any sort of trauma?
Yeah, look, firstly, I don't think it's a competition about whose is worse and whose is better, who has more and who has less. And I suppose also survivors are much more likely to be looking after someone else than themselves, because it's much, much harder to be compassionate about yourself and to value yourself. And so regardless of your situation, whatever's happening is your situation. And it's, no less pertinent than someone else's. So, I think it's time to not put yourself aside. But, what is it that you need in this moment? Start to, find how to care for yourself better, what supports you may have, what you might find useful on a healing journey, whether it's, yoga or meditation or art therapy or EMDR or therapy or a walk in the park, whatever it is, to start to take those steps, because you are important.
I'm so thankful that we're able to have this conversation, because everybody listening will be able to take something away, whether or not you're a person who is looking after someone who's experienced trauma or complex trauma, or whether or not you're somebody who's going through it yourself, or perhaps, at some stage in our lives that might become a part of our world. And so what I'd really love for you to be able to share with us, please, for listeners who are thinking, hey, I think this is a bit of a sign to, take the next step. And I've been thinking I might need some help. And now after listening to this conversation, I think, yes, the time has come. Where would you direct people to start? And could you tell us also, please, about the Blue Knot Foundation and the support that you offer as an organisation?
Well, I mean, obviously tell people to start with the Blue Knot Foundation anyway.
Yes.
So, I mean, we run a helpline, firstly. So the Blue Knot helpline supports people who've had experiences of childhood trauma, as well as people going through the National Redress Scheme with experienced institutional child sexual abuse. And that is manned by trauma therapists 9 to 5, 7 days a week. And that number's 1300 657 380. So people can call there and, and we've had a lot of feedback. What they'll find is someone who's there to, just as we've said, hear, listen, help people who may be very heightened, because, we realise how difficult it is to call out, to call up, and just, help people to ground themselves, support them to help identify what it is that they need in the moment and what it is they may need, depending on where they are in their journey, to help them, move forward. And, we have people ringing and telling for the first time, disclosing for the first time over the phone. Some people in their 80s and 90s have never told a soul, and they've lived with this trauma forever, and it's played out in all sorts of ways in their life. So it's about that safe space, and providing that safe space, and then, trying to understand, what are the next steps. We also have a lot of resources, videos, fact sheets, information on a very rich website. We've got two sort of sites, one for the community, which is for survivors and their family members and supporters, another one for professionals. And we've got a lot of resources there which we hope are quite accessible, which are based on, on the evidence, on lived experience evidence, on research, on practice evidence. So, hopefully are quite useful. We also provide a lot of training for professionals from all sectors about how to be trauma informed, so how to be there to show respect, to help people feel safe, to support people in a way that's empowering, and also how to respond in a therapeutic way if it's a more therapeutic process, and also about how to look after themselves and how to, for their own self-care, because obviously working with people who've experienced trauma and trauma stories does expose you to your own trauma and how to sort of mitigating it's what we call vicarious trauma and the risks of vicarious trauma. So, that sort of describes Blue Knot and what we do. And I suppose the other major thing is we advocate for the whole area of complex trauma and help to raise awareness and help people to understand a little bit more about it and why people who may have experienced may be struggling in their lives and what you can do to help support them.
Yeah, so if you do decide to ring the Blue Knot Foundation, you'll be received lovingly by somebody who understands and is going to be so thankful that you picked up the phone and rang and reached out for this help. And it's a first step, but it is a big step for some people, picking up the phone and, like you say, acknowledging what's happened or just sort of saying it out loud. This first step can be hard, but you can say as much or as little as you like when you make that call, can't you? It's up to you what you want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous step, and some people find that, reading, getting the information first is a good first step, because, it can help you make sense of, what's going on in your world and how you may be reacting and how what happened to you may have impacted you. It also talks about coping strategies and the way people cope, and people cope in all sorts of ways, some of which are, they're all coping strategies at the time, some of which become less constructive over time, and how to start to understand those, but not blame yourself, but start to explore other ways which, may be more constructive for your life going forward.
Yes. Oh, thank you. And something that you touched on before, you talked about going for a walk, and you used this idea of grounding. And when we think about the nervous system, for people who've experienced trauma and complex trauma, feeling grounded is a beautiful place to be. And I wonder, Cathy, what helps you to feel grounded? What sort of things make a difference for you to settle your nervous system and sort of shift back into that sort of more what we call ventral vagal, or that green zone that is where we sort of feel more cool and more calm and more connected with other people.
Yeah, and certainly people who've experienced trauma have a nervous system that's often, on high alert, and people oscillate between being agitated and hypervigilant and often being shut down and withdrawn. Yeah. And certainly for me, I love nature. I love green and I love blue. So, I love being outside. I love walking. I love exercise, music, and children. Just the immediacy and the groundedness of children,
Yes.
because what you see is what you get. And we unlearn that as we grow older, and it's quite refreshing, and certainly helps to ground me.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I encourage you as a listener, no matter where you sort of sit as a listener for this episode, but just to sort of think about where you are at in your nervous system, and that we do get agitated, and those of us that get anxious, like me, we go into fight or flight, and we can go into feeling more shut down. But instinctively, we often sort of know what can make a difference for us. But if we can kind of reflect a bit more on that and think about the ways other people ground themselves, like Cathy was just mentioning, it's nice just to think about what our toolkit is like, because if you're at work and you would really dearly love to get out in nature, and it's so healing, it's incredibly healing, but you can't, then it might be nice to think about what else you might be able to do. And one of the things that I like to do is lengthen my exhale and just take 3 lovely breaths in through the nose, pause at the top, and lengthen that exhale. And so obviously here on the podcast you'll learn lots of different strategies, but the most important thing is that this is an episode whereby you as a listener feel seen and heard, validated and understood, and to know that you are not alone, whatever path you're walking in relation to this particular topic, and that the Blue Knot Foundation is there as a first port of call, and the number was 1300 657 380. And I wonder, Cathy, for people listening who might themselves, like you said a moment ago about vicarious trauma, because I think we're seeing a lot more of that, particularly in schools for teachers, for example. I know there are a lot of teachers that listen. If there is a teacher listening, or somebody who is in a role whereby people do share with them the traumatic events of their life, is that care line a place for somebody to call for that support, even if they're not experiencing trauma themselves, they've got this vicarious trauma?
No, absolutely.
Yes.
Because, it's trauma you're taking in, and you can experience it in very similar ways to people who've experienced direct trauma. And so I suppose what's the important message there is that, none of us are immune
Yes.
to the effects of trauma, and to actually acknowledge that, this is a real risk and it's hard, but there's absolutely a lot of supports out there, and lots of ways that, you can understand it, and you can and mitigate the risks of it impacting you. And certainly, that's about debriefing and finding supervision and whatever sort of the mechanisms are that are provided. But the first thing is acknowledging that this is not about personal weakness. This is not about, the fact that you're not tough enough. It's about being human, and it's about finding out what it is that, will help you as well to stay resilient. And as you said, talked about the nervous system, find that place of calm as well.
Yes. Oh, Cathy, I'm so grateful to you for your time. I really am thankful for you, not only for your time today, but for the incredible work that you do, and the strength and the courage that you've shown throughout your own journey, and what a difference what you've been through and how you've accessed the support that's been so helpful for you is making a difference, obviously, to you in your life and those who know and love you, but also to so many people who you may never meet, but who you're the leader of this incredible organisation that is changing lives. And it's just such an honour to have had the time to speak with you and to share the wonderful work that you're doing with our listeners here. And so I want to thank you again for spending some time here with me today.
That's a pleasure, and that was very generous. Thanks, Jodi.
Oh, thank you, Cathy. And thank you for joining us today for another episode of the podcast. And I really encourage you, look, I know sometimes these conversations that I have with these very special guests can be unsettling. And I just want you to just take a moment just to take good care of yourself, reflect on what, if anything, that this particular conversation has brought up for you. And that number again for the Blue Knot Foundation is 1300 657 380 here in Australia. And I'll put the link to the website, of course, in the show notes. And please reach out for some support. There are lots of people waiting on the end of the phone, and also your GP is another place to go if you need a little bit of extra help. So thank you again for your time, and I can't wait to be back with another wonderful guest next week. Okay, bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr. Jodi Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.